and welcome to this edition of Joy in Our Town. I'm Ann Farrell Tater, your host, and we have a very special edition today where we are interviewing Star Grieser. Star is a professor at Tidewater Community College, and she is deaf, and off camera, we are going to have an interpreter, Marisa Barone, who will be interpreting for me, but my interview will be with Star. And so I'm so delighted to welcome her. Our issue today is education, and our topic is American Sign Language. Star, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, and I'm really excited to learn about American Sign Language because it is its own language. But before we start that, I really want to hear your story. Were you born deaf, or how did this start for you?
I was born with the ability to hear, and at a very young age, it's common with many deaf people to kind of get sick with spinal meningitis. I did get very sick, and I lost my hearing at about 18 months of age. My parents are not deaf. They had never met a deaf person before. They never learned sign language before that time, never been exposed to the world of deaf people. And my mom was young, and she didn't really notice until I was about 3 or 4 that I wasn't kind of developing my ability to speak well. And we went to an audiologist and found out that I had, in fact, lost my hearing. They fitted me with hearing aids. And at that time, the doctor, the audiologist, told my parents, my mom specifically, that it would be best for deaf children to learn to speak and lip read in order to, become part of society. There wasn't really, there wasn't any focus on encouraging deaf children to learn how to sign at that time. And there was really an avoidance at that time with people teaching sign language to deaf children. So I went to public school, and I learned how to speak and lip read. And I met a speech therapist at the school, and she signed. And she just said, all right, I'm just going to teach you how to sign. And I picked it up so quickly. It was very, very natural for me. And my mom recognized how natural it was for me and how easy it was for me to communicate in that way. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't really fully fluent in American Sign Language growing up. I signed some. I tried to speak and lip read some. And then I was involved in the deaf ed program when I was in school, and that was really wonderful. I mean, that was the best method for me to communicate, was using sign language. And then I went to college, and I went to a college that catered to deaf and hard of hearing students. It was called the National Institute for the Deaf in Rochester,
New York.
It's the National Technical Institute for the Deaf in Rochester, New York. It's part of RIT, the Rochester Institute of Technology. And once I went into school at NTID associated with RIT, that was it, really. I mean, it was a very good match for me. So my primary mode of communication now and since then has been American Sign Language. I moved to Virginia about 13 years ago. And I started teaching for TCC as an adjunct instructor. And I just fell in love with teaching. And I was offered the full-time position 10 years ago. Now, so I teach both ASL and interpreter training classes.
What is interpretive training, or what is that class?
So obviously, people who use a different language, your primary language is spoken English, and my primary language is American Sign Language. And so in order for us to be able to communicate with each other, we have an interpreter here today, an ASL to English interpreter here today. And the interpreter is really facilitating between two languages, both English and ASL. the interpreter watches me sign and speaks what I'm saying, and then helps you understand the message that I'm trying to communicate. And then when you talk, the interpreter will sign so that I understand you. So the interpreter is facilitating that communication. It's kind of a bridge, both linguistically and culturally, between two different people in two different languages.
That is amazing, and she's very good. So did she take, she obviously knows American Sign Language, so does she have to start with that and then she learns how to be an interpreter? Those are two different things?
Exactly, yes.
That's interesting.
An interpreter obviously has to be skilled in both languages before learning how to do the skill of interpreting.
Right.
Because conversationally using one language is not what interpreting is. I mean, there are cognitive processes that happen when you are effectively trying to communicate equivalent messages between two languages. And it's a tough process cognitively.
Right. So when she speaks with you, is that a different conversation?
Oh, yes, of course,
That's
very
so
different,
interesting.
because that's our conversation, you know, just in one language.
Right.
But working between two languages is intense, and it takes a lot of brain power.
That's amazing. All right, talk about the history of ASL. When did it come about?
In the 1700s, we had a signed village on Martha's Vineyard outside of Boston, where about 26% of the people that lived on Martha's Vineyard in that one specific island learned sign language. Or I'm sorry, they were deaf and they signed. There was some sort of genetic predisposition to being deaf, and it caused a high incidence of deafness on Martha's Vineyard.
That's so
and
interesting.
many people on that island learned sign language at that time. So obviously this was, so you know, we're talking about 300 years ago, there was sign language right here in this country. And then in 1817, the first deaf school was established in Hartford, Connecticut, and a man from France named Laurent Clerc, he already had been running a deaf school in France. He came to the US and started the American School for the Deaf. So ASL is really a combination of French Sign Language, the language that was used on Martha's Vineyard, and then, you know, there were a couple of other places where home signs were used. And then the first deaf school was established in 1817, and that whole, that confluence of events created the breeding ground for American Sign Language.
That is fascinating.
And we know that language now, obviously, as ASL.
Right.
And as more and more deaf schools were established and built throughout the country, then the language went with it to the different deaf schools around the country. So ASL next year will be 200 years old. It's a pretty new language compared with English.
Amazing. So, all right, now it is a foreign language, considered a foreign language, right?
It's kind of like a complex label, actually, like considering it a foreign language. I mean,
foreign as to not English, I guess. Okay.
Yes,
so
exactly. It's not English, exactly.
Okay, so this is American Sign Language. So each country has their own language, like French Sign Language, Spanish Sign Language.
Yes, exactly.
That's amazing.
Most countries have their own signed languages.
Yeah.
People from Britain who came to America, obviously not deaf people,
right?
But you know, our most common language here is English because the British came and colonized this country. But British Sign Language and American Sign Language are very different. Like if I
Wow.
met a deaf person from the UK, I wouldn't really be able to understand them because our American Sign Language was rooted in France. So if I
Oh,
meet a deaf
right.
person from France, I would be able to understand them pretty well,
That's
actually.
fascinating. That is really fascinating. How about, and then like Arabic and Hebrew, I mean, you may not be able to understand what they're saying either then, right?
There is this gestural form called universal gestures
right.
that deaf people will use to try to communicate with each other internationally. So for short, brief, kind of surface-like conversations, deaf people will be able to use that to be able to converse.
Yeah.
There's an international sign system,
Oh,
if
wow.
you will.
Okay, right.
Many countries use that if they get together for big events, like some sort of deaf international event, a conference. So it's kind of like using one language in
Right.
order to represent everybody.
Gosh, that's so interesting.
So for example, the Olympics are coming up soon, right? And deaf people have their own Olympics,
Oh,
believe it or
wow.
not. Yes, from all over the world, people come to watch the Deaf Olympics.
But can a deaf person participate in the regular Olympics?
Yes, actually.
Yeah, I would
yeah,
think
they
that.
can. Yeah, so maybe there would be a sound barrier in the regular
Oh,
Olympics,
right,
but like with
right.
the Deaf Olympics, there would be no sound barrier like with the start gun
Right,
or like the beep
absolutely.
to start a race.
Yeah.
There would be no sound barrier there in the Deaf Olympics. Maybe they'll use a flashing light
Right.
or something like that
Yeah.
to start a race.
Sure.
And there will be a modification at the Deaf
Yeah.
Olympics, and then obviously communication would all be accessible to the Deaf Olympians.
That's so interesting. All right, so what about if a child is born deaf or as in your situation, lost their hearing at an early age? What is the age that you can start learning this language?
Really, babies with parents who are deaf, they start learning ASL the minute that they're born, just like any other mother or father would talk to their baby in their native language. So it's actually starting to happen in the womb because, if a deaf mother is pregnant, the movements of the sign languages would then correlate when the baby is born to the movements outside of the womb. So it happens, and deaf babies born to deaf parents or deaf mothers start babbling and signing at about 9 months.
Oh my goodness.
And then babies born, obviously if there is a baby that is born deaf, we would want them to be learning sign language as soon as possible.
Right.
I mean, young children are sponges for for all kinds of different things, and language is one of them. And if a hearing child is born to deaf parents, they will learn English and sign language simultaneously. They'll be bilingual.
Right, that's true. Yeah, that makes sense.
So with hearing babies, they can also learn sign language, and it will reduce frustration with talking between mother and baby because infants can start to express themselves using sign language before they can actually start to talk.
Wow, this is absolutely fascinating. Stay with us. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to switch gears and talk about the deaf culture. I'm Ann Farrell Tata. This has been a delightful show with Star Grieser, a professor at Tidewater Community College, and stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you. Hi, welcome back to this edition of Joy in Our Town. We've been having a delightful conversation with Star Grieser, who is a professor at Tidewater Community College. Star is deaf, and we have off camera her interpreter, Marisa Barone. So we're going to continue our conversation, and our issue is education. And this segment, we're going to be talking about the deaf culture. Thank you for staying with us, Star. So can you talk a little bit about the deaf culture and tell us about what it's like living in that world?
Well, any group, any society of people, any community of people have some sort of common bond.
Right.
And with deaf people, it's language. And obviously with other communities, subcultures, language would also be a common bond. So deaf people use American Sign Language, and that is a shared experience. Another shared experience is deaf people going to residential schools for the deaf growing up. That's another shared experience, using sign language at school and being able to access information at school without being isolated at all.
Right.
So many people in their lifetime will maybe meet one or two deaf people. Maybe they'll only meet one or two deaf people in their entire life. And they won't realize that that one deaf person belongs to a larger community with
Right.
events and clubs and organizations and schools and churches and all different things, just like any other community of people. Last week, I went to the National Association for the Deaf conference. There were over 2,000, 3,000 deaf people converged on the conference for a whole week. And also last week at the same time, the same week, coincidentally, was Deaf Expo. It's an international event. It was actually hosted in Las Vegas. There were probably 23,000 deaf people from all over the world at the Deaf Expo in Las Vegas last week. I mean, the Deaf Expo is more at an international level. But then here in Hampton Roads, we do have a lot of deaf events. Like we have Friday night silent dinners at various malls. Yeah. Where deaf people will get together in the food court and get together to talk about the week. And then we will maybe meet at different restaurants for deaf night out.
Yeah.
There's a deaf church in the area.
Wow.
And there are organizations, clubs. We've got a softball team, a bowling league. I mean, it just goes on and on.
So what are some of misconceptions that the hearing have about the deaf culture?
So I think the most common misconception that people who hear have is that a deaf person can't speak. And if they can't speak and can't hear, it's that they can't do many different things.
Right.
You know, I lost my hearing, but, you know, I mean, people would feel bad for me, but I don't really want them to feel bad for me. I mean,
Right.
there are deaf people who are born deaf and they've never even known what it means to hear. So they're ready to go. I mean,
Yeah.
there's so much new technology now. We have video phones, we have interpreters on phones. You can talk with people from other countries. I have an alarm clock with a light on it. I mean, it wakes me up in the morning. I mean, I'm a fully actualized person and I can do everything that anybody else can do.
Right.
You know, there are people who have deaf families. And I have my own family, of course, and then there are groups of friends. I have groups of friends. I mean, just because I can't hear doesn't change a whole lot for my access to what I can do, or
Right.
any other deaf person.
Well, and I read that 90% of deaf people do marry other deaf people. Is that just because that's who they're hanging out with?
It's because
Oh,
of
because of
language.
the language,
It's
yeah.
because of language.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, any successful marriage, communication is the key.
Well, that's true.
So, and it's about shared experiences,
Yeah.
shared values, shared culture, shared community. So yes,
Yeah.
and language is very important.
All right, talk about your class, because the majority of your students are hearing. So how do you communicate with them, especially in the beginning before they learn the sign language?
All of my students, when they first enter my class, they have that same question when they come into ASL 1 and they come into the first day of class.
Yeah.
For the first day, we'll bring an interpreter in
Oh, I see.
to make sure the communication is very clear about the course expectations, about the syllabus, about assignments. We'll bring an interpreter in for the first day of ASL 1. And starting the second day of ASL 1, there is no interpreter there, and that means the students are with me. And we use the overhead, we use PowerPoint, we use gestures, we use facial expressions, and we do whatever we can do, and I do whatever I can do to help them understand. I'll show them pictures that will represent, different concepts that I'm trying to teach them. And the students at first are always very nervous until they realize that, I can do this too. We can make connections here. We can communicate here in this class. And once they come to that awareness, it just goes from there, and it's a very successful environment.
So is it probably, like some people just have an aptitude for foreign language and pick it up really simple? Are there some people that are more, that get it easier? And if so, what skill set do you need to be able to pick it up quickly?
Oh, of course. Yes, that's very true. And also to kind of pick up the language effectively, to learn the language effectively, I think those people who are willing to try, to put themselves out there, to take a risk, and even if they fail, even if they make mistakes, mistakes are one of the best ways to learn. So, and then I can obviously go in and help them modify to correct the mistakes. And language is a social activity.
Right.
So that means the way that I design my class is that I teach some vocabulary because I have to, and then the students immediately get up and start interacting and practicing with each other. So my classes tend to be very social and very intensive with the language interaction. So, language as a skill needs to be practiced.
Right.
And many people think that they'll show up for class and then they can leave class and then come back to class, and they won't have to practice outside of class, but they have to. It's just like reading and writing. Like when you're young, growing up, you need to practice reading and writing to get good at it. Same with language. The more you're exposed to ASL, the more exposure you get, the better you'll be. The more practice, the better you'll be. So, there's tons of videos and online materials, and exposure is very easy to come by very easy to come by now. And then also interacting with deaf community members.
Right.
That is also very helpful in language acquisition at this level.
How big is the deaf community in the Hampton Roads area?
The deaf community in general is actually a small percentage of the general population. I think Gallaudet University is in Washington, D.C., and it's the world's only university for deaf and hard of hearing students. Their research is showing that it's like a very small percentage of the population. They say about a half million
Wow.
deaf people in the U.S.
That's not many at
whose
all.
primary language is ASL. So it's not a lot of people. That's not including people who were born with parents who are deaf and who have family members who are deaf or who are learning
true.
ASL.
Yeah.
So the deaf population in Hampton Roads, we think it's maybe about 3,000 people.
Wow. So at that, go ahead.
Some cities have a larger concentration of deaf people, like obviously in Washington, D.C., at Gallaudet University, large concentration of deaf people. And then at NTID, at the college I went to in Rochester, New York, a lot of deaf people live in Rochester. But in our area, it's about average, I think.
Yeah. So at these universities, do they teach everything in ASL, or do they teach other country languages?
Do you mean at Gallaudet University?
Yes, and where you went.
Yeah, at Gallaudet University and at NTID, it would be the same as ODU, the same as NSU, same as any other four-year college or university, but the students are deaf and the instructors sign.
In
And
American Sign Language?
So they're teaching, the instructors and professors are teaching different subjects using ASL.
Oh, ASL,
And
so they
the
do.
students
yeah.
are obviously expected to read and write in English.
We only have about 2 minutes left, but tell us quickly about the technology. I would think that would be so wonderful now, to technology and aiding the deaf people.
Oh, yeah. Yes, so obviously the use of FaceTime and Skype, that really helps with keeping the deaf community excuse me, connected and grounded.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful. But technology obviously can be abused too. Oh, so there may be a heavier focus and use of technology, and then maybe ignoring the language portion of things.
Right.
And we really want to make sure to keep the language intact.
Yeah, definitely. So about how many students do you teach each year? A lot?
Oh my gosh, 200.
Oh my goodness.
About 200 students a
and
year.
is there different levels, like Spanish 1, Spanish 2? Is there?
Yes, exactly. TCC has ASL 1 through 6.
Oh, wow.
And then the interpreter training program also.
Oh my gosh. Well, we have to close out, but I have thoroughly enjoyed meeting you and appreciate Marisa so much. And this has been a wonderful show, and I know people are going to really enjoy learning about it. You might get some more students out of this. I am Ann Farrell Tata. Thank you so much for joining us today on Joy in Our Town. We've been joined by Star Greaser, and we will see you next time on Joy in Our Town. Thank you so much.
This program has been sponsored by the Trinity Broadcasting Network and made possible by your telethon dollars. Your continual support can keep Joy in Our Town brought to your home every day. So write Joy in Our Town, P.O. Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711.